Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Well, after 4 days on the campaign trail, the federal election race is in full swing. It's been a busy first week of news, lots of announcements, lots of attacks, lots of headlines. But one consistent storyline through this first week of the campaign has been the polls. An apparent surge of support for the Liberals. In the weeks before Mark Carney took over the party, the Liberals had appeared poised for an historic election loss. Now, they appear poised to win, and possibly win big. At least that's what the polls say. But how do the pollsters come up with those numbers? And how full a picture do those numbers show? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we're talking about public opinion polling and the federal election race. I'm joined today by Darrell Bricker. Darrell is the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. Hi, Darrell. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
So a bit about you, Darrell. How long have you been in the polling business?
Since 1987. But my educational background was in quantitative methods. I actually did a PhD in political science at Carleton. So I've been, most of my adult life, I would say, I've been interested in this topic.
1987. So how many federal elections would that be for you?
Oh, God, lots. Since 1988, 1993, all the minority elections up till today. So, I would say at least in the double digits.
Okay, well, you're definitely the right guy to talk to. The reason I wanted to get you on the show today, Darrell, is because of the remarkable turnaround in public support for the Liberal Party in early election tracking polls this week. I mean, in the span of a couple months, let's cast our minds back a little bit. The Liberals have gone from less than 20% support under Trudeau to now leading this election race in early days under Mark Carney. Some polls even have them in majority government territory when you do the modeling and the seat count. So from near annihilation to possible majority government, it's a really remarkable turnaround. So remarkable, in fact, that some people are having trouble believing it. So Darrell, have you ever seen anything like this kind of reversal in public opinion in your years in the polling business?
No, never. I've never seen it. I mean, you can go back to 1993 and talk about Ken Campbell, but the change wasn't this dramatic.
So what do you think is driving it? How is it possible so many people have apparently completely flipped their support from the Conservatives to the Liberals or maybe from the NDP to the Liberals? What do you think is driving that?
Well, it took two things. It took a prime minister resigning and being replaced by somebody else. And it also took what's happening south of the border to direct itself to Canada. Either one of those things happening independently, this doesn't happen. The two of them together creates a very unique environment. So I'd just like to ask people listening to this to consider the following. If Justin Trudeau had stayed in power and Donald Trump had won the election, would this change have happened? And the answer to that, I think, would probably be no. Then ask yourself the following thing. If Kamala Harris had won the election and Justin Trudeau stayed in power, would this be changing? No. If Kamala Harris had won the election and Mark Carney had become the leader of the Liberal Party, would this be happening? The answer is probably not. So it really took those two things happening together.
And to borrow a phrase, events. The events have aligned in such a way that it's created almost a unique situation, a unique circumstance where people have reconsidered what they may have been telling pollsters a couple months ago, yeah?
Exactly correct.
Okay.
So, and by the way, if you're trying to evaluate polls and their ability to actually capture what's happening, or we'll leave the ability question to one side, but if we need to actually evaluate polls and whether or not they're reflecting what's happening at the moment. Don't just look at one poll, look at a whole bunch of polls. And what you'll see in this instance is all of them basically showing something similar.
Okay, let's talk about some of the mechanics of a national poll. How does a national telephone poll work? how are the respondents selected? How do you contact them? How do you process that data that you collect?
Well, first of all, almost nobody does a national telephone poll anymore,
Okay.
at least not the way that it used to be done. So the idea that you have live interviewers selecting a random sample and chasing all the people who are part of that sample isn't really what's done anymore. There are people who do telephone polling these days, but they're usually people doing robocalls with very, very, very small response rates, and then doing a lot of modeling of the data that they get out of that. Most of the polling these days actually involves either a web-based type of polling with panels of people who've agreed to be interviewed, or people that are intercepted online, or a combination of some form of telephone and some form of online. But the idea that there's this uh, uh, battery of interviewers who are out calling random numbers and speaking to people about surveys, that doesn't happen really that much anymore.
Okay, that's very interesting. So some people may think that because you're combining different methods of contacting people, it may make the results less accurate. Is that true?
No, actually, the putting them together is generally a pretty good way, because one of the things that we know about each of the survey methodologies is they have a bias. So people who tend to be online tend to be a little more emphatic in their political choices, particularly people who sign up for panels. They're more interested in being interviewed. They tend to have more emphatic views about politics, particularly progressive voters. And then people that you reach by telephone tend to be the people who would respond to a telephone poll. So they tend to be older. They tend to be disproportionately female in many instances. And if you do it by cell phone, they tend to be older and they tend to be a bit more male. But there are biases, and these demographic biases find their way into political biases. So trying to find a way of offsetting some of the biases by using different methodologies is one way that's proven to be effective. It's really more about a representation of the marketplace, of the political marketplace. So do you have good coverage of what's going on? So there are people who are doing polls where they say, for example, IVR polls, where they're randomly generating numbers. Okay, so yeah, it's random, but it's not necessarily representative, because a very, very small percentage of people actually respond to those polls. So it's not really representative. Representative in the old sense meant that everybody had an equal chance to be involved in a survey sample. That's not really the way that it works anymore, because of the very, very low response rates by telephone. So really, it's more of just trying to get enough people that fit into certain types of categories that you can get a good read on what's happening in the political marketplace.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So I've got a list of questions here. These are some of the things that I have heard from people who don't trust the polls. Let me run through a few of these. Right off the top, pollsters are politically biased towards liberals. Is that true?
No.
Okay. Didn't think it was. Wanted to ask you just to get it on.
No, I mean, there might be some people who, I think everybody who is a name that you would know, who does this in a way in which they provide full disclosure and the reputation is riding on the accuracy of the results. No, you can't accuse them of being partisan.
Okay. We've covered some of this one already, but I'm still going to ask it. When pollsters are calling people, you target people who will answer the phone, people who aren't working during the day, people with landlines, maybe older people in urban centers, not in rural areas. All of them will lean more liberal and conservative, and that will skew the results. Is any of that accurate?
Yeah, it can be.
Okay.
And that's if you're just doing it exclusively by landline telephone. But it's actually the biases in the other direction. They tend to be more conservative.
Really? Okay, so people who will tend to answer the phone during the day, more conservative than liberal.
Yeah, so who answers a landline during the day?
It's generally probably retired people, older people.
Sure.
Right.
Now, this time around, they might be more liberal because older people tend to be more interested in voting for the Liberal Party right now, and younger people less. So maybe there's a bit of a bias that way, but traditionally, no, they tend to be more conservative voters.
When you do election polling specifically, who pays for that? Are you funded by corporate backers with political agendas?
Not for anything that we would be doing for the media. So we're in a relationship with Global News, and they pay for part of it, but we also pay for part of it. And the reason for that is because we believe in participating in the political process, the democratic process, and doing accurate polls is a good way of supporting democracy in any country. So we feel it's part of our responsibility to do that. It doesn't hurt in terms of building our brand and brand awareness, but also it's a mission that we have at Ipsos. So we don't just do it in Canada; we do it all over the world.
Right. So part of those polls, part of it is self-funded, and that's basically like an advertising initiative on your part, right? It's coming from the revenue of your company, general revenue.
And you're also obligated, if you are accepting money from a corporation to do a political poll, you're obligated under the Canada's Elections Act to reveal that.
Oh, okay. So you do have to disclose that if it's.
Yeah, I would say everybody who's interested in challenging pollsters, there is an act. It's called, the Canada Election Act. You can go look at it. There's a whole section on what the obligations of pollsters in the media who report their polls are, what those obligations are. And if they're not living up to them, then feel that you can write either to Elections Canada, or there's an association for pollsters called CRIC, C-R-I-C, where you can also write and register a complaint if you have an issue.
When polls are fully published, there's always a margin of error attached to it. How does a margin of error work?
A margin of error in modern polling doesn't work.
Oh, okay.
And the reason it doesn't work is because there's an assumption about the response rates and all sorts of other things that relate to how the statistics are compiled. That basically the one you're thinking of is 19 times out of 20, plus or minus 5%. There's a whole bunch of statistical rules that you have to follow in order for that to be true. And every single poll that's being done today doesn't follow those rules. So even on our polls, we report what's called a credibility interval, which takes into account some of the realities of the way that the polls are actually done in a modern framework. So I always find it funny if people hold up this thing like it's a shield, plus or minus whatever, and this is my my stamp of accuracy. Well, the truth is, if you actually pick away at a lot of that, you'll find that a margin of error is a very poor representation of polling accuracy.
Okay. Poll results are generally reported also in two ways, weighted and unweighted. What does weighting a poll result mean?
What weighting means is that you are adjusting the numbers that you actually got from your interviews to reflect something, for example, like the demographic composition of the population. So if your final poll results that came out of field, even though you followed all the rules and you did it the way that you normally do it, the Canadian population is 52% female and 48% male. We end up with a sample that's reversed, 52% male, 48% female. You simply adjust.
Right. Okay. So you adjust the data to be representative of what the statistical makeup of the population is.
Yeah, and sometimes there are other types of weighting systems that you can put in place based on likelihood of voting. Past voting, what people's past voting participation was, or their past partisan patterns were. We don't do that, but some other pollsters do.
Okay. When a poll measures, quote, federal vote intention, that's usually the number that makes headlines. What does that mean exactly?
We ask people, if an election was held tomorrow, which party would you vote for? Which party's candidate would you vote for in your riding? And then we usually ask them and if they say I'm undecided, we ask them whether or not they're leaning toward any particular party. And particularly as you get closer to the election, if you're leaning, you're going. So usually what you do is you add those two things together, and that's the percentage of vote for each of the parties that you report. And then usually what we do in Canada, because it works pretty well, is we drop out the undecideds.
So that's a snapshot in time, right? So it's not to say the people who are answering the poll today, there's nothing to suggest that answer may not change over the next 20 odd days of an election.
Oh yeah, we know based on research that we do at Ipsos internationally that, sometimes up to 10% of people make up their mind in the voting booth. So
10%.
Yeah. Well, in the old days when I first got into this, I mean, getting it wrong was like falling out of a boat and missing water. I mean, it was actually pretty easy. And partisanship was a lot stronger. So you'd see fluctuations in election campaigns, but you wouldn't see anything like we see now, because people's partisan attachment isn't what it used to be. So it's only natural that there's a lot of people who are kind of between stools, or between ideas, or between parties, or whatever. They show up on election day, and it's like, depending on how they felt on that particular day, or what they heard, or what they were thinking, they walk into that booth and they make their decision. So yeah, we find in election campaigns, there's a lot of what we call late movement, where people make up their minds very close to the end, which is why it's important to stay in fairly close to the end.
Okay, and that brings me to my final question. When people are reading the news about polls, what would be some general advice for how they should be interpreting that information?
Yeah, if there's a poll that shows something completely different from the trend that you're seeing in various polls, wait a tick, wait a beat before you say that this is a new trend. There are outliers in polling. There are polls that are just wrong that get reported sometimes. So usually wait a beat and see if a couple of the other well-known pollsters come out and show a similar trend. Then you know something's probably happening. But if you just see one poll that is going in a different direction from the way that everybody else is going, the likelihood is that that one poll is not a new trend. It's wrong.
Okay. Food for thought as we make our way into the second week of the campaign. Lots still to come, and lots of things could change. Darrell Bricker, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I apologize to everybody for my cold.
Oh, that's quite all right. No problem. Thank you again.
Thanks.
And again, that is Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, answering our questions about the polls. Can you believe them? Well, you can, but make sure to use those critical thinking skills when you're reading the stories and the headlines about these numbers. And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find us, as always, on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players. We're everywhere. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.